in, welcome in. Thank you all so much for joining. We'll get started here in a minute, but please go ahead and join us in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from. We're so excited that you are here on a Friday to learn about this really important work of restorative justice and community. Please let us know where you're watching from, who you are. I'm so grateful that you're here. All right, we got some folks from Kansas City. Welcome. Couch Cove. Welcome, welcome. Washington, D.C. Burlington, Vermont. Hello. Fairhope. Welcome, welcome. And we're so grateful that you made the time. Got some Newton. We got a fan of Sheryl and Caitlin. Welcome. Ontario. Welcome, welcome. Southern Colorado, Denver, Colorado. And right. We're going to go ahead and get started, but please do continue to let us know where you are from. We're going to be interacting in the chat throughout, so please keep an eye on the chat, stay active, and be a part of the conversation. If you don't know me, my name is Morneau Wesley. I'm the Associate Director of the Zaire Institute for Restorative Justice, which is a program of Eastern Mennonite University's Center for Justice and Peace Building. And I'm so excited to be bringing this conversation to you on the little book of restorative justice and community, reclaiming connection and responsibility for our neighbors, with the authors Sheryl Wilson and Caitlin Morneau. So a little bit of how today will run. We'll have a really great conversation with the authors that will take up most of our time, but then we'll have some time for Q&A. So please have those questions ready. Maybe you've already grabbed the book and you have some burning questions that you want to ask the authors. If you haven't grabbed the book, we'll let you know how to do that. I'll have a quick announcement at the beginning, and then we will close. All right. So again, thank you so much for being here. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Sheryl and Caitlin. First up, we have Sheryl Wilson, who is a restorative justice practitioner, trainer, and educator with more than 20 years of experience. She holds, give me just a second. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Mediation and Communication Studies and a Master of Liberal Studies with a concentration in restorative justice from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. She currently serves as the Vice President of Culture and Belonging at Bethel College in Kansas and is a past president of the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice, or NACRJ. Sheryl is also an appointed member of the Kansas Supreme Court's Advisory Council on Dispute Resolution. Previously, she served as executive director of the Kansas Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, or KIPCOR, at Bethel College. And Sheryl and her husband are parents of 2 adult sons. Welcome, Sheryl. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, everybody. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm so glad you all are here.
And last but certainly not least, we have Caitlin Morneau, who is a circle keeper, educator, speaker, and community organizer dedicated to community-based, healing-oriented solutions to harm and injustice. As director of restorative justice at Catholic Mobilizing Network, she especially engages people of faith in the restorative justice movement. She holds an MA in conflict transformation from the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite and studies theology at Catholic Theological Union. Caitlin lives in Alexandria, Virginia, with her husband, 2 children, and Black Lab. Caitlin, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much, Des Moines Day, and hello, everyone. It is so good to be with you today.
Beautiful. So before we get started, I do want to just drop a link to this beautiful website for the book, so that folks can, go ahead and have it. I'll drop it again later. But just so folks can see the book, what it looks like, maybe if you two want to hold up what the book looks like, just so we can orient ourselves in this conversation. I know you're very excited, and again, just thank you so much for contribution to the field. So to start off, how did this book project get started for you? What was sort of that genesis for you?
I can kind of start this. So for a long time, as I've been studying and reading and writing about restorative justice and what it is, one of the things that I had recognized is that there is a lot of literature out there that pays attention to how we attend to the needs of those who have been harmed and for those who have caused harm. But when we talk about three stakeholders and we use those words, victims, offenders, communities, although some might say victims, offenders are kind of antiquated terms, we still use them. And as stakeholders, they all exist supposedly equally in the realm of what we call restorative justice. But I just didn't see where we were talking about community as something other than support. Like community people are support people. They're witnesses, they're in the background. But I felt like doesn't community have a responsibility as well? And aren't there things that the community can be doing? I felt like at some point I did make my pitch. I made my pitch to who the person who became our editor, Barb Taves, with Little Books. And shout out to Barb. We are so grateful for how she has shepherded us through this process and brought us to this place. When I met with her, it was about a decade ago. And when I talked with her then, we had this great conversation. She was like, yeah, that sounds really like good stuff. But, what I would, and what she said to me was, you might consider getting a co-author. And so I walked away with a hey, she didn't say no. And so I use that as fuel to think about it and to keep, keeping in mind who might that person be. But my life just got so busy. And at that point, I moved forward. And at some point, you know, maybe 5 years later, I had become connected with Caitlin through being on the board at Catholic Mobilizing Network. And as we became friends and associates and colleagues, we had these conversations. And I want to invite Caitlin into the conversation at this point because she said some things that resonated with me along the same trajectory. So I asked her if she would consider um, being on this journey with me and being my co-author. And I will invite Caitlin to continue the conversation.
Oh, well, thank you, Cheryl. And I just continue to be so honored that that the Spirit led us together to work on this, and just the great honor that it's been to journey in partnership these last however many years it's been. And likewise grateful to Barb and her accompaniment, and also have to say, like, thank you to all of the Little Book authors who went before
Mhm,
us.
mhm,
So as for me, when I first learned about and was drawn toward getting involved with restorative justice, I learned about it in the context of legal system work, and I recognize that I didn't personally identify as someone who was directly impacted by crime in the traditional sense. Um, and but I did understand myself as a community member in this triad of stakeholders. And as my journey continued, I recognized and began to kind of better articulate the ways in which really we're all impacted by harm. We have all been responsible for causing it in various forms, and we all carry wounds. And so as I learned to understand these in the fuller picture of my own identity, um, all while coming alongside individuals and communities who were directly impacted by crime and violence. As I sat in these relationships and encounters, it wasn't about um, and aiming to kind of hold and acknowledge these wounds that we carry. It wasn't about competition or comparison about whose wounds count. It was about solidarity, and that we all had a unique part to play in breaking cycles of violence and creating a better way forward together. So likewise, in accompanying faith communities and faith leaders in their restorative justice journeys, I encountered so many people who were grounded and convicted in these values of human dignity and redemption and healing and hope for reconciliation and a vision of beloved community. And these were folks who often themselves, sometimes were, but often themselves were not directly impacted, recognized that many of their community members were. And they saw the promise of restorative justice, but didn't necessarily see themselves as process facilitators. And so they were holding these questions of, well, what's my role? What could involvement or engagement look like for me? And this was all very much alive in me when Sheryl and I had that consequential conversation that I think is no coincidence that it happened while we were in Montgomery, Alabama, serving as co-circle keepers on a civil rights immersion. And at that time, like Sheryl, and the way that life happens, I was working full time. I was parenting 2 small children. I was starting a second master's. And I really wanted to be sure that my yes meant yes. And so I did take a pause and said, oh my gosh, I'm so honored. I want to discern this and take some time and get back to you. Before I share the next part of this story, I will just offer a quick forecasting that it does make mention of fatal gun violence in my neighborhood. So a few weeks after that conversation with Sheryl, and I share this story in the book, my neighbor's son was killed by gun violence just down the street from our house. My family and I actually happened to be on our afternoon walk. As we walked past my neighbor's house, his friends encountered her as she got out of her car, and they broke the news to her about what had happened. And all I can say is that the sound of her cries are still imprinted on my heart. Mm-hmm. And in a new way, despite being in this work for years, in a new way, I was asking these questions of what is mine to do? And I think it was the next day that I called Sheryl and said, I gave you my yes, because if bearing witness to that moment isn't the epitome of this theme, then I don't know what is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much, Caitlin, for sharing that story, and to you both for sort of giving us some understanding of the sort of heart that goes into producing a book like this. So thinking about that really big word of community, I think it means a lot to a lot of different people. It is a word that is used a lot, but perhaps not with great specificity. And so I'm wondering, for each of you, what does community mean to you? And in this day and age, in our present society and culture, what do you see as the barriers to building community?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Des Moines Day. I can kick us off with this one, but really, we actually want you to kick us off with this one. So we would love for folks to drop in the chat for us what does community mean to you?
Mhm.
In a word or a phrase or whatever comes to mind. What does community mean to you?
And I'll drop it again just so folks watching on other platforms can also see that question.
Great.
Thanks.
Support, connection, belonging, we the people.
Mm-hmm.
Inclusion, concern, being seen, investment, belonging, commitment, interconnectedness, mutuality, journeying through good and bad, compassion and accountability. Sitting at the table, people looking for each other. Oh my gosh, so much goodness. I'm sure I'm gonna miss some. Connected web of relationships, being proximate, being aligned. Oh, there's so much goodness here. Thank you so much. Shared experience.
Yes. Oh.
Oh, so good. I
Well,
see so much here, Sheryl, that was resonant with us as we were writing. Do you want to say a few words about that?
so I think about, oh my gosh, so many stories. Some are in the book and some are in my head. I'm and of recent times. But I think about the ways that even the ways I was brought up. I was brought up in a place where I had the good fortune of having lots of family around me. So my family was my first community. I didn't go anywhere where there wasn't a cousin or an aunt or a grand. I had four grandparents in the same city. So I'm so grateful and fortunate, and two very attentive parents. So in that way, I felt that connection of community very early in life. I think what I draw from those experiences has to do with how we keep choosing each other. I want That's going to be a consistent theme for me. When I think about the ways that family connects with each other for good, bad, and different reasons, there are ways that we may not always agree. We may not always have the same trajectories, but there is something that tethers us back to each other, and we keep choosing each other. And that is something that I carried forward in my ways of living in different places around the country. I do hearken back to times when I lived in a city block in Minneapolis, where in that city block we had a good cross section of intergenerational, multiracial, um, all areas of the socioeconomic spectrum in one city block, and we checked on each other and we did for each other. And we had national night out together, and there were times when I thought, we had what MLK talked about with that beloved community. I do recall a situation where I had to um, struggle because I knew there was harm that happened in my neighborhood, and I wasn't even aware of a situation that I talk about in the book, where there was a unfortunate situation of a child having a child who made an unfortunate choice to put the child in the garbage, but thankfully the child was able to be found in time, and the child lived. But the point being, those of us who knew, those of us who didn't know, who I was one of the people who didn't know. And then when I did know, I didn't know what to do. And so community in that time meant a lot of I had a lot of indifference about what I needed to be and how I needed to act. And so for me, figuring that out and being on this journey had become so important. So all that to say, community is one of those things that we move forward in ways that we continue to do the work, we connect with each other, and we continue to choose each other. And we, with doing the work, means we figure out how we have the norms and the shared beliefs that tether us together, so that when something happens, when harm occurs, we know that we will stay connected to each other. And I'll pass it back to you, Caitlin.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Sheryl. Yeah, I mean, as I think back on when we were developing these sections of the book of, okay, how do we want to define community for our readers, but also for ourselves, and put that in the context of our experiences, we were reflecting on, what are those places that we kind of organically or end up in communities by default or by choice. There are ways in which we might share common characteristics or activities with people that kind of put us in community. That there are ways in which we find community by virtue of common culture, common experience, maybe of harm, but maybe of other kinds of things, common geography, from our neighborhood to our town, city, region, you name it, common interests, and how we, whether that's sports or music or other kinds of activities, common beliefs, of course, and then our common humanity, and kind of understanding our interconnectedness with one another. And some of us feel more kind of in touch with or clear about those groups or subgroups that we are a part of, proximate to, living amongst, than others. But it was an invitation to us, and we hope to each of you, to think about, oh yeah, what are the kinds of communities that I participate in, or feel adjacent to in some way. And then in that, we are also mindful of how our communities, again, whether we consider ourselves in them by default or by choice, how those communities shape us. And we'll get into later, how we can help shape our communities to be more restorative, but they also shape and form us. In terms of, from a very young age, to Cheryl's point about our families being our first communities, kind of setting and modeling kind of behaviors, how we act with one another, our expectations for ourselves and others, including assumptions that we make about relationships, how we think they should work, how we think that groups should work or people should treat each other. And all of these impacting kind of our general sense of belonging, what it feels like to belong, and what it feels like to not belong, to not feel safe, and what are the indicators in our brains, our feelings, our bodies, that that help us to notice what belonging looks and feels like for ourselves and for others. And finally, that these communities shape our expectations for responding to harm and conflict, whether in healthy or unhealthy ways. And so with that being said, I'll pass it back over to Sheryl. I'm eager to hear some of your reflections on Des Moines' part of the question around present barriers to community.
Yeah, I think about some of the things that we talk about, the things that tether us. If we're not mindful, there are things that will pull us apart, or there are ways that we never became familiar with each other in the first place. Um, I can't say enough about our society today. We are more polarized than I ever remember. Um, there were times when things would happen where people were having differing opinions, where if even though they differed, it was more like a debate, and they would go out to eat afterwards. Even though they had these differing opinions, they found ways to still be connected. Neighbors who may have differing political beliefs, or or coworkers, would still find ways to get the work done or be in community together. Today, what I see often happen is people truly retreating, people truly choosing their sides, and finding other people who have the same, like, trajectories as them, the same level of belief. They would feel more comfortable being with those folks than to dare cross that line to hear someone from a different background. I think about the ways that um, when we look at what happens when we don't cross those lines, and the cost that what happens when when that disconnection happens. There's a cost to it, um, and we limit what is possible for our collective healing when we choose to not cross those lines. Community requires difference. If we, that saying, if you have there's a need to have your friends be different from you. And so often we get caught up in having the same people that come from the same place. Well, when that happens, you need to get a new set of friends. And so in my mind, you got to have people who maybe are the naysayers to you in your group. You got to have people who are of a different ethnicity, of a different socioeconomic background, to make the community. And it also is a call toward our own ways of bridge building. For me, it's about continuing to create spaces where people can connect across difference and stay in the conversation. I honestly really get more energy from contributing to a world where we resist the fragmentation, and instead we practice the hard, necessary work of being in community with one another. I had a friend tell me this once. We were having probably a heated debate about whatever with a group of friends. And she said, I would rather stay in this and fight with you than to be on the outside of this group and have no one. And that resonated with me, that sometimes it's worth the debate, but staying in connection. Again, going back to choosing each other. So, Caitlin, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Sheryl. And thank you for outlining not only what we're up against, but also the hope for what we desire to be about. I think that as we were writing, and certainly well before we started writing, we recognize that experiences of community operate at multiple levels. And in the book, we refer back to this kind of nested model throughout, and that includes these four levels of where community can operate, and where we know harm can operate too. That at the innermost level is that individual internal inner experience. And then there's the interpersonal of, one-to-one relationships or that direct interaction. Third being the kind of communal or group experience, because community can be really big. So to think about it as, those particular group experiences, and then the societal and structural experience. And when it comes to barriers, we wanted to break down how particularly common interpersonal challenges we encounter, as Sheryl mentioned, are sometimes at play as barriers to community. Some of these predominantly including our abilities and willingness to listen and get curious about other people's experience, to empathize even when we don't feel like their experience is representative of ours, and to kind of expand our capacity to tolerate difference, while of course not tolerating injustice, but being able to tolerate difference. And we knew how important it was to, within this, to name the structural barriers of racism and trauma that permeate our institutions, our policies, our conceptions of community, and our everyday thinking and behavior. And knowing that these are often operating in ways that we may not even realize, but are often at the root of harm and conflict in our communities. And so we aim to expand on those ideas and also offer some reflection questions for individuals and communities to be able to ask of themselves, bring into dialogue, to make explicit what is often kind of operating quietly or implicitly, because when we're aware of how these barriers and challenges show up within ourselves and our interactions and our groups, then this awareness, acknowledgement, and willingness to enter into dialogue around it within these groups that we affiliate can be a first step in mitigating and breaking down these barriers in order to be able to show up differently in our relationships and in the world.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you both so much for fleshing out some of those barriers and hitting on that point that we have to know what the barriers are in order to better address them. Both of you mentioned sort of in your opening comments, instances of harm in community that really served as an impetus to some of your thinking. And so my next question for you is, when harm happens in community, what do you see as the role of restorative justice? And more particularly, what roles can community members play in restorative justice processes?
Absolutely. So when harm happens, restorative justice is an invitation for us to respond in ways that repair relationships and not just assign blame as punishment. So if we're thinking about community as a full stakeholder, then we believe that those who are in community actively participate and they're not just on the sidelines. So what we want to create an understanding of in this book is that people who are community members go from that stage of hesitancy, like I was talking about how I was hesitant in my neighborhood to react, to respond. We want to empower people to feel ready to participate. There's often that hesitation, and it's a real thing. And I have to say, I had already learned about restorative justice then, but I think it's really putting those ideas, as they're not concepts, but it's really challenged me to make it a way of my life. I don't want to be that person who puts on that restorative hat in a classroom or in a community setting. I really want to live that. And so I say finding the middle ground. So in the book, I talk about there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum between minding your business and being all up in someone's business. Restorative justice is the space that is that middle ground that helps us to react in a way that is most appropriate for that given situation. And so somewhere in the middle between those two ends of the spectrum is living restoratively, is responding as a restorative community. So all that said, the goal is to help people define their role, and what those roles look like. Participation might look like going beyond simply offering support, and they can be formal roles or informal roles. Like, we know that the informal roles have to do with bearing witness. You might just be standing on the side watching. There are many of us now, we know how to take out our cameras, and we know how to film so that when we see something happen, it's on record. We know how to do that. We know how to act as engaged bystanders. We also want to help people to understand how to show up with presence and care. So we offer some thoughts about how you can do that in a way that you are being very intentional, and offering support to people who are directly impacted. In other formal ways, there may be system actors who are professionally involved, but we can ask them to think through the restorative lens. There are a lot of people who have great skills and great training and all of that, but they may not have that restorative lens, and that's what we want to help people to act toward. We also realize that many restorative processes will involve some type of dialogue or accountability process, and we want to talk about how community members have roles as far as those processes might permit. And we want to help people sharpen those roles. We know that people, again, have been introduced a lot of times in restorative ways to those processes, but we want to help people to sharpen those roles. So holding space for all of these people who may be secondary victims and or carrying indirect responsibility themselves. So all of that, finding space to hold what restorative processes speak to for all of the people who represent the community. So Caitlin, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks. Yeah, and I recognize that we're doing all of this while ourselves immersed in the field of restorative justice work and with you practitioners as our community. And we hope for our readers to include experienced practitioners like yourselves, that this can kind of add to and expand upon existing conversations in the movement. We're also mindful that for some folks encountering this book, it may be their first introduction to restorative justice. And so we knew it would still be important to outline its fundamental philosophy and principles and guiding questions for a firm foundation to then expand on. And so we go through that practice of focusing on the harms, the needs, and the obligations of naming some of the core values of respect and dignity, responsibility, repair and making amends, reintegration and interconnectedness, healing and transformation. And we come back to the core questions of restorative justice. quite a bit, particularly in wanting to then be able to outline a set of questions for community members to ask themselves when wondering what is mine to do. So I don't know about you all, but in my education and outreach work, I frequently find myself, naming for folks those core restorative justice questions of, what was the harm, who was impacted and how, and what needs to be done to make it right. And I have a lot of appreciation for the many organizations who have created those little cards where on one side is those questions adapted for people who have caused harm and adapted for people who have experienced harm. And I know I carry those around in my wallet and with me all the time. So we were really feeling compelled and inspired to say, okay, what does that set of questions look like for someone who is a community member, and asking what is mine to do? And there are quite a few. I won't give them all away here because we want you guys to go buy the book. But to give you a brief preview, starting out with just grounding questions of like, okay, what do I know about the situation and what happened? What do I not know? Because I certainly don't have the whole story. And from what I do know, how did I find out? Were those, trustworthy sources? What more is important for me to know in my own discernment in moving forward? And what do I not need to know? What isn't mine to carry? Um, and and then to take a moment and slow down, and sometimes we have that instinctual and noble reaction to immediately reach out, and it's important to pause and ask myself, how, at whatever distance time it's been since the event, to think back like, okay, how did I react at the time? What did I experience in my brain and my feelings and my body? And how have I been affected since? These things aren't happening in a vacuum. And in the ways that I was affected or processing, what prior experiences that I have might have been connected to those reactions. And what of my own needs, what might have been activated, and what of my own needs might need tending in order for me to um, engage with those directly impacted in the most balanced and responsible way. And so we want to encourage community members to take their own experience seriously and not minimize it. And then, just as one more example questions, based on my relationship with the people involved, what is my responsibility or my obligations within this web of relationships, taking into account other systems and communities that may be, reacting, responding. And so this helps us attend to any temptations to overstep or over assume what our role may be. But we also just want to invite a lot of grace for ourselves and others, so that we can have the courage to not just stand back and, as Sheryl said, mind my own business. Whether that's through accompanying someone in help driving them to court, or watching their kids while they go to an appointment, bringing a meal, honoring anniversaries and important dates. But it may also look like, I actually, after doing this discernment, I'm not sure that that's my role, because I know that others are more appropriately responding in that way. But I do feel compelled to other kinds of community engagement that works to attend to the structural contributors to violence like this, that I can help be a part of ending. And so I'll just say quickly that we do, mention and outline key restorative practices such as victim-offender dialogue, circle process, and truth and reconciliation practices or processes for communities to understand and look to cultivate. And as Sheryl's already mentioned, trying to weave some stories from our experience and our relationships in community alongside those. Anything you want to add, Sheryl?
Yeah, I want to give a shout out to Bethel College, where I work as Vice President of Culture and Belonging. And in the past, I had been the Executive Director of the Kansas Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, KIPCOR. One of the things that we do on campus currently related to building community is truth, community healing, and transformation circles. So we call them at Bethel circles of belonging, and on purpose, because we want people to have an opportunity to connect and bring all their layers to a process where we talk about identity, we talk about our where we're from, we talk about the concerns that we are currently experiencing on campus. And we also try to give people an experience that they probably wouldn't have in any other context. And what I've found in that sense of providing that opportunity, again, is giving a restorative process, being in circle, connecting in dialogue, really works toward community healing. And so in that sense, I really feel like in practice, that is something that I really strongly endorse, communities coming together in ways similar to that in Circle. And some of you do, I imagine. But that is something that I think is a practice that I always want to encourage. I also recognize that when we operationalize our restorative values, when communities, understand their roles, they're more naturally and collectively able to shift the ways that they may come out of challenges in community toward ways of really hearing. I think about people being heard and seen in environments without needing to debate the idea of who should be involved. It's casting that wide net to pull as many people into a process as possible. I also feel like people walk away with a greater sense of understanding, clarity, confidence, and a willingness to engage in ways that strengthen accountability, connection, and healing.
Beautiful. Thank you both for giving us some more context, some more understanding of what it really takes, or the community's role when harm happens. But thinking even beyond harm, in the book, you propose this notion of building a restorative community or building restorative communities. And so I'm curious, what does a restorative community look like, and how do you think we get there? And whoever wants to start.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Demointe. We're gonna kick it over to the group again. We want to hear from you guys. When you hear the phrase restorative community, what comes to mind for you? Thanks for dropping that in the chat, Demointe. So when you hear the phrase restorative community, what comes to mind?
Got answers rolling in now.
Yeah.
Do you want to read them out this time, Sheryl?
Yeah. So grace, compassion, accountability, shared values or guidelines or norms, having the hard conversations. Yes. Everyone belongs, a commitment to reintegration when harm happens, relationships first, needs being met, healing and acceptance, a group of trusted individuals, inclusion, belonging, and facing conflicts together, relationships, listening. No one is cast aside. People are called in. We know how to be accountable. A community committed to each other, holding each other accountable, but also holding each other in love.
Oh,
Inclusion and space for generative conflict.
beautiful.
You
Oh
all
my
are
goodness.
bringing it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so
Yes
much.
to all of those things.
Yeah. Yeah. I gotta, well, as someone who works from where I work, I just have to say amen. Like
Mm,
amen to all of that. Um, and I think one of the things that we dialogue quite a bit about, you hear both in the introduction and in the conclusion, this recognition that like beloved community
yes.
is the aim. Beloved community is the aim. It's the vision. It's the hope. We probably won't get there in our lifetimes, but we can create pockets of beloved communities that keep us going, encouraged, fortified, committed to um, one another's dignity and to each other, and that to achieve even mini visions of beloved community, that cultivating restorative communities through particular approaches and practices are a way to get there, a way to help us see that possibility and that vision in real time before us. And before I say more, I actually want to read out for you how we describe restorative communities in the book. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge that when we are writing and now, that we do not by any means see this as being unique to restorative justice organizations. I think those of us that do identify in that way have a call, a mandate to walk our talk first and foremost. And so yes, this is for us. But that any community, neighborhood, group can cultivate these restorative ways.
Mhm.
Whether that's in their title or mission statement or not. So I want to read out for you how we described it, which is to say that restorative communities do what is possible to prevent harm and heal harm when it does occur. They do this with grounding in restorative justice. This means that a community is oriented toward right relationships, equal respect and care, and serves as a guiding light for how members relate to one another and systems function. It sees belonging as recognition that each person has needs and obligations that need to be met, and that engagement is central to meeting them, especially when community members have been impacted by an issue or harm. They abide by values such as trust and healing, repair, collaboration, interconnection, and interdependence. And they seek to repair harm restoratively, supporting those who have been harmed and holding accountable those who have caused it. So with that, we wanted to try to give some practical guideposts for a group who's thinking, okay, what does that look like in our day-to-day? And you guys named so many of these: leading with values and shared agreements, prioritizing listening as our kind of orientation toward one another and learning, and consensus decision making. These are things that we get to do in circle, but also can take shape beyond circle process or formal practices, or convenings. But also, getting to viewing conflict as an opportunity for growth instead of something that needs to be hidden or denied or squashed, and leading through collaboration, both within the group and beyond the group itself. Sheryl, what would you add?
I would say that in this context, I think about the ways that we can slow down to take the time to do the work of staying together, to again choosing each other, extending welcome, celebrating the little things, um, ways that we invite people to reconnect. There may be people that we've known or we have had something together in the past, but we have to restoke those fires. Um, and the ways that we support each other and grieve together. I can't say enough about um, the way that people experience loss. And a lot of times when people are experiencing loss, people fall off. And that is to have people who will stay in it with you while you're going through the grieving process. That is a beautiful way of connecting in community. And the ability that people have, there are some folks in our communities who have the ability to recognize gifts within oneself and helping others to identify roles. Um, and then there are ways that we take on those roles, as we said. It's a it's a list of things that we talk about in the book about being a participant in a process, maybe being a facilitator, convener, a seed planter, a bridge builder, an advocate, a communicator, an administrator, or an evaluator. So you hear the informal types of ways that we might be engaging with each other. And this is a non-exhaustive list. Um, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I know we already have some questions rolling in. We will certainly get to audience questions, but one last question for the both of you. And it is, what do you hope for readers to take away from reading this book? What is your ultimate hope?
So I'll just say I want to read a little from the book. So I'm gonna quickly say these things. But being rooted in right relationship, there isn't enough that we can't say about that. Staying in right relationship, commitment, choosing to commitment over convenience. If I'm committed to you, that means that I'm not thinking about what's easy. Sometimes what's hard is what I need to do to stay in right relationship with you, to be in good community. It's something that's practiced and not imagined. Like we can't just because of geography say we're in community. We have to practice it. We have to do the work in the sense of continuing the relationship. Some of these things show up in formal ways, like a circle, or some of these are just the ways that we talked about just choosing to be connected to each other. That we constantly center and be as inclusive as possible, that we use the principles of restorative justice as a guide, and that we go from the moments, like there are a lot of things that that come about by happenstance, but creating the culture is something that we do when we're doing the work. It becomes our culture. And how we get there is we practice the right relationship practice of connecting with each other consistently. That we create the spaces, as I mentioned, about creating the spaces for dialogue, slowing down the decision-making and response processes. We intentionally live out the restorative values and in our everyday interactions. And ultimately, a restorative community is one where connection, accountability, and care are not exceptions. They're the way people choose to be together over time. I want to read you one of the last little reflections that I write about in the book about a connection that I would say is what I hope for in every community that I'm in. But I say in the book, during a trip to Chicago, I convened the members of the local restorative justice community with a I did this with a group of friends of mine who and colleagues who we were all attending the same conference. Um, the place that we chose, the venue, was stunning, comfortable, welcoming, with beautiful art on the walls, which made greeting our guests feel effortless. Some were new connections, others felt like old friends. When the doors opened to the dining area, we found an abundance of savory and sweet delights. As nearly 40 people gathered, our hostess shared the history of the space. We gave thanks for the meal. I sensed some were waiting for what I say the other shoe to drop. They were waiting for the agenda or perhaps a fundraising pitch or something to ease their minds. I paused and I said, there was no agenda, there was no ask. Our only intention was to be together, to let them know that they were seen, and to lift them a little higher than when they arrived. For me, that gathering was a glimpse of the beloved community I long to see.
Mm.
I'll pass it over to you, Caitlin.
Thank you so much, Sheryl. Yeah, I mean, I think you said it all so beautifully. That, like you, I felt moved to close with a story, bringing it from the large group to the small. And I think about how my children are my greatest teachers, and we've just talked so many times about how just all the many incredible teachers and communities and leaders who shaped our ability to put this book into the world. And we know how we stand on your shoulders. And when I think about my children as my teachers, that this particular story comes to mind in a really special way. So my oldest son was 3 years old at the height of the pandemic, and he's just beginning to become verbal and ask questions about the world around him. And so often when we were out and about, we still needed to stay at a distance from folks. And so he would ask me about people that he saw. And it just felt really like disingenuous and really disconnected to say like that person over there. And so we were watching a lot of Daniel Tiger and said, you know what, we're going to take a cue from Mr. Rogers here. And so we would refer to others, strangers, or people we knew as our neighbors, whether they lived down the street or we were visiting a different state. And it was a couple years later that he was becoming more aware of the work that I do, and asking really important questions, and me trying to put it in age appropriate ways. And it was not long after that incidence of violence on our street that I remember we were driving to preschool in the morning, and he says, "Mom, are people in jail our neighbors?"
Mm.
And I mean, my heart just burst, because all I could say is, yes, Yes, my child, they are. But the fact that that's where his mind and heart went. I share that to say that, my heart, my hope, our hope for this book is that hearts may be that of children and opened to seeing and treating one another as neighbors, even where maybe we've become disconnected, or but that rather we may see one another as neighbors, as integrally connected, and as mutually responsible for one another, even and especially in the midst of harm.
Beautiful. Thank you both so much for sharing those stories. And I can't thank you enough for putting this work into the world, for the field, and for our broader, community. So thank you again so much. Now is the time to turn to the folks watching, our community watching at home. We have this one question that I actually think is a great place to start. And someone says, I don't know my neighbors. Any suggestions? And I think that's a great sort of building block of building a restorative community. Any suggestions?
Go ahead, Caitlin. You look like you.
No, what was funny was came to mind. We moved into our house just before the pandemic, and we had these like great ideas about like all these cookouts we were going to host and leaving things at people's doors, and that we didn't live up to. But a couple years later, another friend in the neighborhood was like, everybody. And I was like, I don't really, you think so? But honestly, what I attributed it to is I have two excuses to go for long, slow walks: my dog and my children with small legs. And I think truly just going for walks a lot can be a really great way to just encounter people and maybe make that intentional choice to say hi when you wouldn't have before, or ask a question or start a conversation. So that was what first came to mind when I saw your question. And of course there are other ways to maybe take note of different things happening in neighborhood associations and things like that. But that's what immediately came to mind for me. What about you, Sheryl?
I think food is a great unifier. If there are, you don't even have to bake. You can take something that is store-bought, and people would still love you for thinking of them. But there are a lot of ways that over the years we have either made meals. We used to be the hospitable people in our community. I'm not that as much as I used to be, but I'll still occasionally have someone over for dinner that is close by, or I have taken I take in strays. I take in people who, especially considering the fact that I am at a college, and I live just right off campus. Um, for Easter, just for example, we had a student over, and it just felt so good. It felt so good to entertain like that and love up on somebody, and knowing somebody who's far away from home who could offer them a home cooked meal. But I do think of food as a way of connecting with people all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I love what you both offer in terms of, getting connected, and also just the sort of simple, Caitlin, what you offer of seeing and being seen. So even if maybe you don't have the sort of confidence to like go up and introduce yourself, just sort of building that habit of like seeing one another and knowing one another in that very casual way, I think also contributes maybe to a feeling of safety in one's community, which kind of brings me to a question as we're waiting for more people to fill the comments. That question of safety in community. What were you thinking about that as you were writing the book? How are you thinking through safety, what it means, what it requires?
I think about that minding your business piece, and that we can, I think on one end, safety meaning, well, I'm totally safe if I do nothing, if I just stay in my little space, or I pray, people say, I'm gonna pray on it, I'm gonna pray for you, but they don't wanna, I think there is in being safe, a lot of times it means maybe you're not necessarily approaching someone alone, but it doesn't mean you do nothing. It could be maybe me and another neighbor will go and check on this person. Or maybe it's me and my family will bring you the pie. Or maybe it's me and a group of I remember in one neighborhood, we all lived about a mile radius from each other. We watched each other's kids. And if there was a neighbor that it was in need, we would just bring them in with our kids. And that those situations feel safer to us. Sometimes there's safety in numbers. Sometimes it's a phone call versus maybe a personal interaction or an email. Sometimes there are just ways we can choosing not to act versus acting in ways that are at our comfort level. I think that the choice should always be to act. That's what I push myself to think about is, will I regret doing nothing? Will I have regrets if I do nothing in this situation?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm reflecting on organizations that I admire and appreciate, where I've been to their webinars and do exercises of like, and in circle trainings I've been a part of like, what does safety look and feel like to you? And the words and images that people come up with are homes, nature, connection, so many of the things we've been talking about. And yet we live in a culture that attempts to convince us that safety will be attained through surveillance and punishment, when in fact those systems and approaches often lead to feelings of less safety, and sometimes realities of less safety, that safety is attained when needs are met. And so I think we were really leaning into this. What does it look like to meet the needs of our neighbors, our loved ones, our community members, that adds to a sense of safety. I know after my neighbor's son was killed, there were members from the HOA who went around the neighborhood inviting contributions toward funeral costs, and a vigil held at the site of the shooting. And it was that ability to come together around the site where that violence and loss had happened, that we could see each other in a new way, and know that, oh no, like we are looking out for one another. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you both for that. This I want to share, not a question, but I think a really beautiful comment. It says, for me, I took from the book and this webinar a way to give depth to the role of community during a process, but also in our daily lives. I chose to continue this work. Thank you for this gift. I think that's a beautiful.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Debbie. She's one of my colleagues nearby, and she's in Missouri, but we're all, this is that Missouri, Kansas connection. So thank you, Debbie. Yes.
Something else I'm sort of thinking about as folks are thinking of their questions is I can imagine that the work that you all lay out in the book of building a restorative community could happen without ever actually ever saying the words restorative justice to your
Yes.
members and to your neighbors. But I am curious if y'all have any thoughts around how do you invite others into an understanding, your community into an understanding of restorative justice? How do you begin to build that knowledge set? And do you think that's necessary to doing this sort of work?
Do you want to go first, Cheryl, or do you want?
Yeah, sure. I don't think I say this all the time. I love the words. When I heard the words restorative and justice the first time, 30 some years ago in a classroom, taught by Mark Ambore, I was stymied. I was like, "What is that?" You know? And so this idea that I have to live by using those words, sometimes we're in polarized times where restorative justice sometimes has a stigma attached to it. So I'm not married to the words. I do um I gain strength and support from those words, but do I have to use them in everyday connection? No, I do not. And I often think about the ways that we go to what feels familiar in community is right relationship. When we say being in right relationship, there's something that I think people connect to, want to honor that, get that. And so if we think about the ways that my situation with a community member, there's some fracture, there's some harm. If we are already in good relationship with each other, then writing it feels important. And so in that way, I think as I said before, it has become more and more important to me to live out whatever this is that we call restorative justice. It's how I want to be in community with people because it feels natural. It feels like um it's the legacy I want to leave.
Yeah. Amen. Um, yeah, I think de Mointe about inviting them into the experience first. That I agree with Cheryl, whether we use the words or not, or maybe we let folks know what they experienced afterward. But when we can be clear about the purpose of our coming together and let the purpose of that conversation be at the center. And if you have the opportunity to use a circle process or a restorative practice along the way, beautiful. And then once people have experienced it, they start to say, what was that? I want to do more of that. um and I think, the other thing to be that we can be mindful of is that, there are communities, there are groups within groups. And sometimes, like, let's say we work at a big corporation, that it can be easy to look at this book or something else and say, like, and feel overwhelmed of, like, oh my gosh, how could I possibly, I'm not the CEO, how could I possibly get this whole organization to, make this change? um and it's good to, like, think big and imagine what that could be, but also to think about, okay, where am I within that? And maybe I'm not the CEO, but I am the leader of this particular department. And we have this particular kind of meeting or conversation we need to have. And I can introduce having that conversation in an intentionally restorative way that can begin to permeate the way we enter into relationships. And just to say that it doesn't have to be group processes alone. It's also about how I um when I, mess up in my friendship, choosing to reach back out to that person and say, I think I really messed that up. I'm so sorry. Is there anything else you need me to know? Like, how can we make sure that this is okay? Rather than sweeping it under the rug and just hoping it passes. And so I think committing to creating the experiences, and then if and as we're able to put language around it, that it can create a kind of sense of commonality and familiarity, that's great too.
Mhm.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So I'm going to give space to look at the comment sections. But I'm a student too, so if no one asks questions, I'm going to ask another one.
Thank you,
But I'm going to give some space.
Let's see.
While we're waiting as well, I want to go ahead and drop again the website, which gives information for how to purchase the book. It gives the endorsements from other authors, practitioners who have read the book. Yeah. I see a comment. Much of what hasn't been talked about is within a restorative mindset and community is non-judgment. How do we hold accountability and support one another requires us to continually do our own work to detangle discomfort from a feeling of safety.
Mhm.
Privilege can be a binder and barrier to create restorative community. We must always be honest with ourselves. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Lots of
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cynthia, because one of the sections of the book that we just didn't get the opportunity to talk as much about, but was a really, really important part of it for us, was an entire chapter we have dedicated to the restorative self and questions of reflection that then are grouped by the many themes that we explore in the book. And particularly around like those structural barriers to community of racism, white supremacy, trauma, really spending time in self-examination around those so that we can practice self-awareness, recognize where we might be jumping to judgment and mitigate that within ourselves. So thank you, because that, yes, just 100% yes.
Yes. I mean, I can't say enough about recognizing one's and this is yes, this is connected to um the ways that we might look through an anti-racist lens, but it is also power and privilege cuts across all of our identities. And so if we do not recognize our power and privilege in situations, even the well-intentioned ways we are offering something, we are trying to walk with someone through something, if we're not cognizant of our power and privilege, we potentially could do harm. And so we talk about recognizing, and we also talk about the fact that you don't do this in a vacuum. You don't do this like, yes, the self work is important, but then there's the work that you do in community where you ask people, how do I mean, I'm just real straight with people sometimes. How do I come off? What is it? What am I giving off an energy that I need people in my life to help check me. And so you're doing the work when you're asking the peers how you can be your best. If you're doing it with this, and I will say, I'll use the word arrogance of I know what's best, and then you go out and do the thing that again has the potential to create something that could be a harmful event. So always checking in with people, asking the questions, that's part of the work, because we do have blind spots. And so we need each other for that, so that if we are caring for people, we do the best that we can to care for them by doing the work with other people so that we can be our best for others.
Yeah, and I appreciate this comment that was just shared. In our work, we moved away from the idea of non-judgmental and instead focus on practicing non-shaming. Judgment is an internal human response, but how we choose to express it externally is what matters. Our commitment is to ensure that regardless of what arises internally, we do not project shame onto others. Yeah, I love that idea of unconditional positive regard for one another. It's really beautiful.
Yes.
We have about 5 minutes left. I have another burning question, but I don't know. We may not have time. One thing I'm thinking about is folks who see that title of restorative justice and community may be thinking for themselves about like community-based restorative justice processes. So restorative justice processes that work outside of like system processes. And I'm curious, if you think like the book is a good resource for that sort of thinking of how restorative justice can be held in community. And if so, what might you clue people into in the book?
You want to take that, Sheryl?
I do think it can be a resource for people who are looking outside of systems to help mitigate circumstances that of harm that might come up. And I think particularly thinking about the principles that we talk about, that we want to help people to use to build restorative communities. If we draw something from that, we probably, I'm not saying that there aren't situations that don't call for system actors, but I think ultimately I draw strength from the community that bore me. The people in my community, I grew up in a, uh, uh, I would say an HBCU connected community where, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, where I had professors and coaches and people who were staff at this institution as my neighbors. And in that, sometimes when things would happen, people would just gather and handle it. And there was no, and some of those people were systems actors themselves who took off those hats. And they said, I know I'm a cop. I know I do this in my daily life, but this situation does not call for someone to be system involved. And so, how can we in our community work toward the healing of this community without involving someone in what could potentially cause harm in a different way? So, I'll stop there.
Yeah. And I'm just consistently drawn back to the phrase of that the people closest to the problem ought to be closest to the solution. And, I think we talk about restorative justice as a lens shift. I feel like even just this orientation of centering the people most impacted is almost a lens shift within itself. And so if we can just kind of further, if this book can help to further embed and encourage that integration of thinking wherever we are, in our institutions, or as I'm thinking about my neighbor and knowing that she is closer to the solution and the situation than I am. But I'm still a connected part of this picture. Then I think we will have done our job.
Yeah. So beautiful. Thank you both again for sharing your time and your wisdom and your work with us. I'm going to drop again the website, which again gives some opportunities for how to purchase the book, but also shares a way to get in contact with Sheryl and Caitlin. And you may be hearing from Sheryl and Caitlin after this webinar as well for other ways to connect to the work. But I'm so grateful to you both. Thank you so much for being here. Wishing you both wellness. And for our friends, just one last pitch. Again, if you enjoyed this webinar or you've connected to us with other webinars, please reach out to support the work of the Zaire Institute, and reach out to me and the Zaire Institute if you have a burning topic that you want to share with the community. I'm always happy to be in conversation with folks. So please reach out. Take care of yourselves, nourish yourselves, and if you can, nourish someone else. Wishing you all so much wellness. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, DeMonte.
Thank you both.